so happy to have all of you here. It's a wonderful turnout. And we're in Minty's parlor with Minty here. Thank you, Minty. It is a lovely place to be. Jessica Wilkerson is with us, Dr. Jessica Wilkerson, and we're very happy to have her tonight. I have to admit, I've kind of stalked her. Now, that's kind of a harsh word, but I looked back at my email, and I emailed you February of 2024. It has taken 2 years to get her here, and that's because she's been very busy. She's currently writing 2 books, and at that time, she was at West Virginia University, and you had just gotten a Carnegie Fellowship, which is a Brainy Award. It's always known as that. So we're just thrilled that she is here and can talk about the women of our area. I think you're going to tell 3 stories, right? And one of them is really close to her heart because she went to Carson Newman, and one of the professors there introduced her to this story, and it made her fall in love with women's studies. So when she finished at Carson Newman, she went on to Sarah Lawrence and got her master's in women's studies, and then her PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So we are delighted to have her. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were persistent. Mary Ollie's right. It took a while because I was moving around. My life was kind of upended a little bit, but I'm glad to say that she found me once I made it to Knoxville, and I made it to East Tennessee, which is home for me. So I'm really delighted to be back. Because I think in that first email I said, well, I always look for reasons to come back to Tennessee.
I just didn't know it would take 2 years.
No, I know. And sadly, my mom, she was a doctor's appointment early in the morning, so she couldn't come on to me, but she really wanted to be here too. So she would have loved it here. Minty, she would love to meet you, and she would love this room. So it really is an honor to be here with you all this evening. And I'm going to give a talk, but I mean, I really just kind of want to just chat with you all and like treat it truly like a parlor and have a discussion. So I will leave lots of time for Q&A. And I want to extend my very deep thanks to you, Mary Ollie. This was so delighted to be invited, and thank you to all of you for being here. So tonight I'm going to share, as Mary Ollie said, 3 stories from the book that I'm currently working on. And this has been a kind of long-term project. In some ways I've been working on it for as long as I've been a scholar. So I wrote 1 book, To Live Here You Have to Fight. I brought copies of that. If anyone's interested in that book, I'll give you a really good rate on it. But when I finished that book, which was based on my dissertation, and it was during the pandemic, and I thought, well, what do I really want to work on now that I can't travel a lot, I can't do a ton of research? And so what I ended up doing was going back to all the research I had amassed since I went to graduate school, and really in some ways since I went to Sarah Lawrence College, where I got my master's in women's history, and thought about how would I tell the story of Appalachia from the perspective of women. And so I started that project. Then I thought, like, this was 2020, 2021. I thought it would be really quick. I thought I would just write it fast and get it done. And I did write an initial draft pretty quickly. And then I had the opportunity to get a literary agent and to think about the book for a trade press, which means a general audience. And that is a new exercise for me because it means writing in a different style and thinking a lot more about audience than we typically do with a book published for a university press. And that's not to slight those books. Those books are really important, and I wrote one of them. But it is a different genre, it's a different style. So tonight I'm going to share with you a little bit about that book. So I wanted to just acknowledge, first of all, that there's been so much written about Appalachian history. There's some really great books, and these are some of them. You may be familiar with some, like John Alexander Williams, Appalachia, and a history. It tells a sweeping story of Appalachia. Ron Eller's Uneven Ground is really for anyone to tell the story of Appalachia since 1945. We've got stories about cultural history here with hillbilly, stories of industry coming to Appalachia and transforming the region. Appalachia on Our Mind is about the idea of Appalachia and what it's meant in American history. And so these are all really important books, but women aren't really in them that much. And that irritated me. That's always irritated me. I'm like a dyed in the wool when it's a story. It's like, I want to know what women were doing. And part of that comes from my own family history, being around women in East Tennessee, where I grew up, hearing stories from those women, hearing about their lives, and knowing they're really rich stories to tell. Now there's some, these are two books that I really like. Women of the Mountain South is an edited volume. If you're interested in Appalachian women's history, this is a good place to start. And so it's got articles or kind of chapter length pieces by different authors. And then it also has primary sources. So it's also great for teaching. And then Women, Work, and Family, and then Antebellum Mountain South by Mona Dunaway, who taught for many years at Virginia Tech. That's a great book about 19th century Appalachia and women's labor. And what you'll also see as I tell you about my book is that I'm really interested in women's labor history as well. So basically, as a person trained in women's history, I wanted to come home to Appalachia, to East Tennessee, and this is way back when I was first starting grad school. I thought, I want to rethink telling Appalachian history from women's perspective. And as many people do as they work on a dissertation, it gets more empirical. So I focused on Eastern Kentucky. But then once that book was done, I could broaden out again. And so that's what this book does. So I just have a few questions here about why I think women's history matters. It is Women's History Month. And I think we've got a captive audience here that probably values and appreciates women's history. So I preach it to the choir, but women's history enriches and broadens our understanding of Appalachian history. So it's helped me to rethink who the major actors are, how do we interpret Appalachian history, how might we interpret it differently through women's experience. It also reveals gender as an important category in what I would call the making and remaking of Appalachia, because there is an idea of Appalachia that kind of emerges in the late 19th century, and it has a lot to do with gender, it has a lot to do with histories of race in this country, and I can say more about that later, but these are some of the things I was thinking about. And then I really wanted to showcase women as historical actors engaged in political and social struggles over power. And then to link them to other women across the country and across the world, because Appalachia is not as isolated as people think. People have always been moving in and out of Appalachia. The first inhabitants of Appalachia, of course, are indigenous, southeastern indigenous tribes, including the Cherokee. And so people are moving into Appalachia, encountering and interacting with the Cherokee. Cherokee, of course, many are forced to leave, and the people are moving in behind them. So there's a lot of movement in Appalachia, a lot of interaction. Another scholar whose work I'm building on is Barbara Ellen Smith, and she's a sociologist, and she has this great article, Walk-Ons in the Third Act, about women in Appalachian history. And she says, when women move to the center stage of Appalachian history, their experiences begin to disrupt, contest, and transform dominant interpretations of the region. Okay, so my kind of big question for this book that I'm working on is how does women's history help us understand major economic and social transformations in Appalachia, but also the United States in the 20th century? So this book, at first I thought I would do kind of the sweeping 200 plus years of history, and then my editors were like, no, you're not going to do that. So I'm narrowing to the 100 plus years of history will be on display in this book. And then lastly, just as a kind of, I'm trying to just give you some of the backdrop of what this book will do. I was really encouraged by my editor to think about lessons we take away and that we learn from history. My initial reaction to that, to be honest with you, was, no, I don't want to do that. Historians are very uncomfortable with saying there's a lesson we can extract for our present, because our present is brand new and it's oftentimes hard to figure out, is there a lesson? Like, history doesn't really exist to give us lessons. But she convinced me that that is actually a really good approach to writing history when you're trying to reach a broader audience. And the way I started to think about it was less a kind of one-to-one, like, here's the lesson for today, but more about feeling less lonely in our present. Because there are people in the past who've been struggling over many of the same issues that we struggle with today, and it's a part of a long struggle. And one thing I know, I've always known about Appalachian history, is that in large part, it's a history of the people's struggles. And I'll say more about that in a little bit.
It didn't.
Okay, so what I'm going to do for the rest of my time is share with you, as Mary Ollie said, 3 stories from the book. And these come from the first 3 chapters of the book. And each chapter is written about one woman or a group of women, and it, as I said, has a kind of takeaway, big lesson for us today. And so the first chapter is called Care Radically, and that's the lesson for us today, is that we need to care radically. And the person is Sarah Blizzard, who's known as Mother Blizzard, and she was in West Virginia. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her and how I came to this lesson of caring radically. So let's see. So Sarah Blizzard was born Sarah Rogers in West Virginia in 1864. She grew up on a farm in the New River Valley. Has anybody been to the New River State Park or National Park? Yes. So you've been near the home of Sarah Blizzard, and she was born right as the state of West Virginia came into being, because West Virginia was Virginia until it seceded during the Civil War. And so at 15, Sarah Blizzard married the 17-year-old boy, Timothy Blizzard, and the two set out for the booming coal towns of West Virginia. Now, her family had a farm, but there were 11 children. She married Timothy, who had already set out on his own. His family didn't have farmland for him, so he had been working in the logging industry, but then decides to become a mother. And so when she marries him, she leaves, and they start moving around to these different boom towns. And so I started the book with them because it's a moment of massive transformation in Appalachia, especially central Appalachia, where the coal industry moves in. And so they set out, this is one of the towns they live in, Kilsyth, West Virginia. And Timothy works as a miner, as I said, and Sarah maintains their home. They end up having 5 children. And of course, living in a coal town is really hard work for women. They have to maintain life in that coal field. And of course, unpaid work, although she also would do paid work on top of that. So Sarah and Timothy were like many mountain people in the early 20th century, who in the thousands moved to places like the coal fields of West Virginia as they were pushed out of agriculture and pushed into new industries that powered industrial capitalism in the United States. And so the coal that that these men were mining was allowing, all the steel production. It allowed cities to be built, trains, railways to be laid. And so just to give you a sense of that transformation, by 1909, 176 companies in West Virginia employed a majority of the 70,000 miners in the state. And coal production jumped over about I think it's a 15-year period, jumped about 1,000%. And so these are places that are transforming. I mean, people describe it as changing overnight, right? It's happening over weeks and months. And so this is work that it requires long hours, low wages, dangerous working conditions, especially those very early mines. And that transformation of men's labor, right, as men are moving from farms to coal towns, women soon also move to the coal towns. Now, sometimes they would keep the family farm and they would continue to maintain it while the men were working in the coal mines, and the men would go back and forth. But that really bothered the men who owned the mines because they wanted the families to be near the mines so that they were devoting their entire lives to that work. So what I say is that the coal bosses also wanted to capture women's labor. They wanted women close to the coal mines because then the men who were working in the mines would be less likely to leave and help their wives on the farm because there was a problem of absenteeism, which of course they interpreted as the miners were lazy because they didn't show up to work all the time, but actually they were going home to work on the farm. So we see that women moving into these coal towns and the capture of their labor. And the way I would describe their labor is care labor. Like they are doing all of the things that are required to keep people alive. They're doing everything required to reproduce the workforce. So the fancy term for that is socially reproductive labor, but for our purposes, we call it care labor, and it's very familiar to all of us, right? If you've cooked a meal today, or soothed a baby, or worked in a garden, or taken a family member to the doctor, you've done care labor. And so care labor really transformed as industrialization took off in Appalachia. And so as a historian, what I wanted to do with this chapter and with this story is to think about how care labor transformed in this period and how care labor has a history. So the way that we take care of one another doesn't just stay the same across time. It actually changes just like other kinds of labor. And so what does it mean to historicize care labor? And what we know for these women, and these women are doing laundry in a coal town in West Virginia. But what we know for them is that their labor really intensified when they moved into these coal towns. For one, coal towns are extremely filthy places because coal dust gets on everything. And also, they don't have a farm anymore. So they did have gardens, sometimes like community gardens that they could use. But the way that they grow and produce food changes. They have to purchase more food. So then they're going into debt because most of the miners are paying into it, which is company money. And so they're going to the groceries, to the company store and purchasing things there. So a lot of things change about their labor. And then also people get injured in the mines. The first disasters happen almost, in the early 20th century, kill hundreds of people at a time. And then there are the smaller accidents that might incapacitate somebody for the rest of their lives. But, it might be 5 or 6 people get injured in an explosion. So the point is, a lot of people are getting hurt in the mines at the time. It was the most dangerous job in the country. And so who do you think who took care of all these people who are getting sick or getting incapacitated or getting injured or being widowed because their husband was killed in the mines, and then they have to take care of their families. And so that transforms their labor as well. Grieving changes. Like, I've thought a lot about and looked in the records about how women grieved in this period and how alert they were to the dangers of the coal mines. So there would be whistles or kind of indicators of an accident, and women would rush to the mine face. They would gather and they would wait for news of who was hurt and who was injured. So for Sarah Blizzard, she didn't escape these conditions. Her oldest son, Arthur, I know very little about him. The records are pretty silent about him. But I know that he was her red-headed boy. I know that much, which I think is such a sweet detail. And he died in the mines, I think, when he was 20 or 21. And so she would have been the one to to prepare his body for burial. And we can imagine how hard that was to raise a child, to go into the mines, and then almost the finishing years, he died there. So the mines, that transition has a big impact on women's care labor. And then it also is, I'm also a labor historian, and I'm a daughter of a union organizer, granddaughter of a union organizer. So I think a lot about how we organize around work and what work means in our lives and how work has a history. So the one other reason that I start with Sarah Blizzard is because she was there during the first strike, the first major labor struggle of what is known as the mine wars in West Virginia. And so this is a series of mine strikes over a period of a decade. And so these are, and who's heard of the mine wars before? A handful of people. I think you probably have a sense the coal mines are a horrible place to work, and the miners don't have many rights. In fact, they don't have labor rights, but they also don't have civil liberties in the coal mining towns. There's a secret police force in many of these towns. They're paid in company money. There's no freedom of speech. They're fired as soon as they question the boss. And so miners start to organize under the United Mine Workers of America in 1912. They'd been organizing before that, but this is like the first major strike in West Virginia that kind of catches on, and it becomes major national news. And so Sarah Blizzard's family was very involved in the mine wars for the whole time, the whole decade. But she was specifically there in 1912 and 1913 during what's called the Paint and Cabin Creek Strike in Kanawha County in southern West Virginia. And thousands of miners went on strike at this time. And they made a lot of demands about wages, about the kind of domination of the coal companies over their lives, over the secret police. This is a picture of the Baldwin Felts. These were armed police in these towns. The miners were saying, we don't like this, and we want the companies to stop using secret police forces against us. And so this strike becomes pretty violent. Conditions get really bad, in part because when they go on strike, the coal operators evict them from the homes that they rented from the companies, right? Because there's total control of these towns by the companies. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the strike, but just briefly, you should know that basically the miners arm themselves. The governor calls in the National Guard. He declares martial law in southern West Virginia. It's considered the largest like the whole Mine Wars period is considered the largest labor uprising in U.S. history, armed labor uprising. So this is usually a story that's told from the perspective of those armed men. And I can understand why. It's a very dramatic story. If you go to the Mine Wars Museum, and Jack has probably been, like, you can think there's a lot of bullet casings, there's like battle lines, people do reenactments. It's like the Civil War, but like the Appalachian version of that. It's the miners' Civil War. And that's all great. But I wanted to know, what did that look like from the perspective of women, and in particular from Sarah Blizzard? And so just a few details about that. So one thing that I learned pretty early is that Sarah Blizzard and Timothy hosted the famous Mother Jones, who's one of the most important labor organizers in U.S. history. They hosted her on her first visits to southern West Virginia. Then she gave these speeches where you can't really see here because it's close up, but hundreds of people would show up to hear her speak. And then she would call on the miners to organize, and they would basically follow her. She was considered the miners' angel. And so Mother Jones is there, and she's helping to organize the men, but she's also spending time with the women, and the women are hosting her. So they're in some ways making her visit possible by allowing her into their homes. And of course, she did a lot of fundraisers where she got shoes and clothing for the families. And then along with Mother Jones, there's the many, many unnamed women who, and some of them are named in the records, who took care of the workers and their own families during the strike. And the way that they did that, and it's pictured here, is they set up tent colonies. So when families were evicted from the company home, they got these tents from the United Mine Workers. They set them up on the property of people who owned their land, which at this point included Sarah Blizzard. So there was a tent colony on her property. And they took care of one another so that the miners could hopefully outlast the bosses and keep the strike going. And so they formed these collective communities in these tents. And Sarah Blizzard talked about collecting food for the people. She had, I think, I want to say 20 tents near their home. She would send her one of her boys out to hunt squirrels so that he could take it to the tent colony. And so these are really important spaces for organizing, which get mentioned a lot in the histories that have been written, but I'm looking out in a room of women. We know who organized the tent colonies and made them possible. And I think putting that at the center to me was really important. So another thing that the women did was they spoke out about the violence that was inflicted on the mining families. And so, I talked about the capture of women's labor by the coal bosses. They wanted the women to live in the towns. Well, when the strike happened, those same coal bosses sent the private police to the coal miners' homes, oftentimes when women were there alone with their children, and the police, this private police, the Baldwin Felts Guards, would go and harass them. Sometimes they beat up women, sometimes they ransacked their homes. So the coal bosses understood the significance of women's labor and of women's spaces, and they sent people there to disrupt those spaces. And the women spoke about this a lot. In one of the most famous examples, a coal boss one of the coal operators led an armored train into one of the tent colonies where he ordered the police, which included county sheriff plus also private police, to fire a machine gun upon a tent colony. Miraculously, only one person was killed. Others were shot, including one woman. And so the women gave a public statement, a sworn statement about this that was published soon after. And then many of them, including Sarah Blizzard, testified about what they called the death train. The coal operators called it the Bull Moose Special, but in the records, the workers and many of the women call it a death train. And so they end up testifying before the Senate, U.S. Senate, about what had happened, and hold the companies, want them to be held accountable for the violence they inflicted. And then the other thing about Sarah Blizzard, and the reason I say she cared radically, is because she and a group of women, right after this attack by the death train, they organized themselves, and they go out in the middle of the night and they tore up the train tracks to keep the operators from sending more trains in to attack the tech colonies and to attack the workers. And so to me, radical means to transform. And so she and the other women, in my interpretation, they're using their care labor to attempt to transform the conditions of their society. Much the same way that the unionized miners were. I mean, they're trying to transform their working conditions. The women are also thinking on that scale and about what does it look like to live, to have your needs met and taken care of and protected. So that's Sarah Blizzard. So that's chapter 1. And I just went on too long about it, but I just love it so much. And I should say briefly, she raised her children to be pro-union miners. So Bill Blizzard, her son, who she used to send out to do squirrel hunting, he went on to lead the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is the most well-known moment in the mine wars, which is the big labor uprising, armed labor uprising. And then her grandson, or great-grandson actually, is Cecil Roberts, who just retired as president of the United Mine Workers. Wow. And I've gotten to hear Cecil tell, he often starts his speeches with his relationship and stories about Sarah Blizzard, who she was his great-grandmother. So he met her when he was a boy. He has memories of her. Okay, so the second chapter is about Memphis, Tennessee Garrison. Another West Virginian. So I know we have one West Virginian in the room. Clearly I was living in West Virginia when I started this book, and I was really drawn
it's
to
the center of the universe.
It is. I mean, I came to understand. Although, East Tennessee is God's country, but Memphis, Tennessee Garrison is also from West Virginia. And the lesson that I take from her story is something that she described about her life. And at some point later in her life, she said, "All I've ever done is to try to meet a need." And that was really a guiding philosophy for her. And I was really kind of taken by that kind of declaration. What does it mean to live your life meeting needs, meeting other people's needs and those of your community? So she was a teacher and a civil rights organizer. She was born in 1890 in Virginia and raised at the turn of the century during the rise of the Jim Crow era and Jim Crow laws, which of course West Virginia looked a little bit different than states like Tennessee and others further south, but it was still a Jim Crow state. And she devoted her life to education and to civil rights. So just a little bit about her. She was born to formerly enslaved parents. Both of her parents had been enslaved in Virginia. And she grew up being surrounded by her mother's family, including her grandfather, who had been enslaved and bore the marks of slavery on his back, the scarring of his back from being assaulted. And he used to regale her with stories of the women in her family. And so she always traced her own history back to her African grandmother. I think she was probably a great-grandmother, but a woman who always stood up to the enslavers anytime she could to defend her family. Memphis is named for her paternal aunt, who was in Memphis, Tennessee, and was one of the first Black educators following emancipation. And so her parents named her for the place where her aunt worked as a teacher. So that's why she has this amazing name, Memphis, Tennessee. And so when she was a girl, Memphis and her family moved to West Virginia. And so, well, for Sarah Blizzard and her family's story, we see kind of a nightmarish version of West Virginia and the coal industry. I was really interested in how, for Memphis, Tennessee Garrison's family, it was really a place of opportunity. For Black workers, moving from the plantation south to the industrial regions of Appalachia provided a lot of opportunity. The work was hard, but they would receive the same wages as white workers in the same position. Now, that's not to say it was all equal. Black men were often given the worst jobs in the mines, but they would be paid the same as the white men who had the same job. And so in many ways, West Virginia was kind of a promised land for Black workers who were looking to make better wages, or a wage at all, right? Sharecroppers didn't really make wages. They went into debt. And so her family moves to McDowell County, West Virginia, which becomes this thriving kind of just center of Black life and urban life, really. It was a very industrialized, very urban place then. And so they go there. Wesley Carter, her father, works in the mines. And he dies pretty young, tragically. He's hit by a train. And Memphis's mother, Cassie Carter, becomes a domestic worker for a rich white family of coal operators in West Virginia. And so she then becomes the sole supporter of her children. Now, Cassie was determined that her daughter would receive an education. And this is not Cassie. This is a Black educator in West Virginia, Carrie Williams, who's one of the women, Black women in the state who fought for education for Black children. And it's because of her and because of people like Memphis's mother, Cassie, who were like really putting pressure on their communities to fight for education for Black children, that West Virginia would probably be known in the South as the best place to go for education. Their schools rivaled many of the white schools in the South, and certainly in West Virginia. They were called Culling schools at the time. They were considered some of the best schools in the state. And that's because people like Carrie Williams, who was an early educator, and others fought for that system of education. For Memphis, she's able to go to school through the 8th grade in West Virginia, and then there was no high school for her in her community. So her mother scrimped and saved her money and sent her daughter to Ohio, where she could go to high school there. And then she would continue to go back to Ohio. She'd go back and forth and take college classes in Ohio, and then in Bluefield, West Virginia, where there was one of the early struggling Black colleges. And so Memphis is tall. She's in the front. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, kind of the fourth from the left, the tall one there. And I just love she has many of her photographs from her time in school. And so, Cassie was determined that Memphis would be educated, and she was. Here's another beautiful image. She's on the end there on the left front. And when she finished high school, she came home to West Virginia to become a teacher. And this is her teaching certificate that's in her archives at Marshall University. And so she becomes a teacher in one of these booming coal towns where you have thousands of Black working class families and their children who are, enacting freedom. Like, what does freedom look like? Well, for them, it looks like being able to educate your children. And that was really, really important to them. And so she becomes this really creative teacher. The way that people described her, like her former students, talk about how joyful she was. how chatty the rooms were. Like the principal would complain about how loud her class was, but it's just that the children really loved being there. And she really made a space, and she talks about creating a space where Black children could be children. Because remember, in 1920, 19 teens, 1920s, West Virginia, these were violent places for many Black children in the South. And so she created these spaces where Black children were valued and treated like kids just going to school. And so Memphis spends her young adulthood in the school system, making these really robust schools for Black children. And then she starts to turn her attention to civil rights in West Virginia in the 1920s. Now, we usually think of the civil rights movement as happening later, like in 1954. There's Brown v. Board and Rosa Parks' a famous sit-in, or her famous activism in Montgomery in 1955. But as many scholars have shown, there was a lot of civil rights organizing and activism happening well before that. And so Memphis gets involved with the NAACP in the 1920s when she learns about W.E.B. Du Bois and his magazine called The Crisis. And she starts distributing The Crisis in McDowell County, West Virginia. She helps found numerous chapters of the NAACP in West Virginia. In fact, you would kind of call her like the grandmother of civil rights activism and the NAACP in that state. She was really good at starting chapters. She also got her students involved in some of this work. Her students would distribute The Crisis. And along with all of that, she also got involved in local politics. In West Virginia, women could vote prior to the 19th Amendment. They had more progressive voting laws locally. And also, Black women had a bit more political power in West Virginia. And so in the 1940s, Memphis ran for office in McDowell County. She ended up not winning, but she became very enmeshed in the local political scene. She does things like bring speakers into town for these emancipation celebrations that happened annually to celebrate the emancipation from slavery. She's involved at the national level in activism to make lynching, to pass anti-lynching laws. So I know it's like an absurd thing to say, but that is something that she was very involved in. And so she was incredibly active in her community, and it's hard to kind of sum up her activism because she was involved in so many things. And that's why I landed on to meet a need, because when something came up in her community, she would get involved. One of the stories that I love from her oral history interviews that she did in the 1960s is she was talking about the Depression, and she was teaching at a school, and she knew that many of the minors were out of work, and many of the children did not have access to enough meals in the day. And this is before there are free breakfast programs or lunch programs at schools. And so she coordinated with a local cook, and she made sure that every day she was teaching, the kids in her classroom and at her school had free food, and that she fed them so that they could learn. And that kind of like sums her up to me, right? She wanted to meet a need. And I just end here with this statement she made about being Black in Appalachia, right? Because a lot of people whitewash Appalachian history. They don't realize that Black people have always been in Appalachia. Slavery existed in Appalachia. Many people like Memphis and her family moved to the region for opportunities. And so there's a very rich African-American history in Appalachia. Okay, so finally, lesson 3. This is reaching the circle here. This is where I really started as an Appalachian historian that Mary Ollie was talking about. I So to come full circle, when I was maybe a junior in college, I read this classic article by Jacqueline Hall, who would eventually become my advisor for my PhD, for my doctoral dissertation. But she wrote this article in the 1980s about textile workers in Elizabethton, Tennessee, who went on strike. They worked at a rayon in the middle there. Does anybody know that article? It's called Disorderly Women. When we leave here, go find that article. It's so beautiful. It's really what turned me on to history. It's beautifully narrated. It also is about East Tennessee. And it's about young women, many of them 14, 15, 16 years old, who worked in a textile plant, and they were mistreated in that plant. And they went on strike, and they set off a strike wave of textile workers across the South. And these were girls. And, you know, I was not that much older than them when I read the story, and I thought, like, this is incredible. These are girls in places that I know of, in a place not far from where I grew up, and they were part of making U.S. history and labor history. And so I decided, even though Jacqueline's article was perfect, and there's no way to improve on telling the story, I decided to kind of come at it in some different ways, and I went to the archives at ETSU, where these records are contained, and take a stab at telling the story. And the lesson for this one is raise expectations. Because as I went through back to those records and to some of the oral history interviews, what I really came to appreciate is that these 15, 16, 17-year-old girls, and sometimes women in their 20s, were making demands that raised expectations of the workers in their communities, but also of what it meant to be a girl or a woman in the South. And so they were really challenging some of the dominant ideas of how, especially white women, should act, how they should be. And I should say the textile industry was, at this time, entirely the domain of white people. There weren't Black women working in the mills. They were very segregated. So this story starts with Margaret Bowen. This is a picture of her when she gave testimony at the U.S. Senate about the strikes. And she led a group of girls out on strike at the rayon plant. It was a German-owned plant that had opened just a few years before. It's called the Bimberg Glanzstoff plant. And they made hosiery. And almost as soon as the workers, as soon as the factories open, like, workers are just like going on strike. And this really confused the operators of the rayon factory, because they've been told by the Chamber of Commerce, you should open your plant here because these people are very docile and they will never protest. And then, like, they immediately protested. And so I love this image. This is outside of the factory gates, where you have all of these young women in their Sunday, you know, the finest clothes, in their hose, and they look so cute, and they got their coats on them and their hats, and they're on strike. And some of them actually would climb over the fence and encourage other workers to come out with them on the strike. So it starts in 1929, and it becomes national news. And so I want to just point out, just because I love this story, and it's one of the stories that really turned me on to history, this young woman here, whose name is Clara Turner, but she went by the name of Texas Bill, and everybody called her. And she would not give her actual name or given name to reporters at the time, and she wouldn't even give her name to the judge when she was arrested and she was charged with disorderly conduct. He asked, you know, what her name was, and she said, "My name's Union." She would like have these little phrases that she would use instead of giving her name. But she was known as Texas Bill. She becomes the female star of the pickets. And she was from Eastern Kentucky. She had supposedly, I mean, I think these are tall tales, but this is what she told the reporter. She went to Texas. She got married at like 13. She went to Texas with her husband, worked as a ranch hand, and then got divorced because he wanted to work and she wanted to bootleg. And so she is, that's the story she tells. And then she somehow finds her way to Elizabethton to work in the rayon plants. And she is disorderly like the whole time. She immediately gets there, the girls are on strike. And so I don't think she ever really works that much. She just like joins the picket lines. And so she's an amazing character. But she's the one that got most of the news. She got most of the headlines and was on the front page. But there are a lot of other images of the textile workers. Here's one of girls who were arrested and sent to jail. Again, usually it was disorderly conduct. They were picketing. They were violating the injunction. And basically, the injunction was to keep workers from striking. So the judge ordered this injunction, and it basically said they couldn't go anywhere in town to protest. And so anywhere they were protesting, ultimately, they would be in violation. And so hundreds of them were arrested. So the strike is happening in the spring of 1929. And then a month later, another strike starts in Gastonia, North Carolina. And this is Ella Mae Wiggins. She was from the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. Her parents were loggers. And she becomes a major figure in that strike, and she sings the songs of the strike. She becomes the balladeer. She carries the message of the strike through her music. And she also sings a lot about being a mother, a working mother who is trying to raise children. She has 5 children. She is a single mother. She works these, really long hours in the textile mills. And it's a brutal life. And so she sings about that experience, and again, is raising expectations for other women like her about what they should ask for, what they can ask for, what they can start to demand. She is tragically assassinated during this strike and becomes a martyr of the Gastonian strike. So this is all happening in 1929. There's kind of a lull in the organizing, but then in 1934, thousands of textile workers go out on strike in the general strike of 1934, including in Knoxville, all over East Tennessee, really, in North Carolina, South Carolina. And these workers go on strike and they put pressure on Roosevelt, and ultimately this leads eventually to New Deal laws like the Wagner Act that gives workers the right to collectively organize and bargain. So we can understand like some of the labor laws we have now, it's rooted in stories in Appalachian women's history. I've gone on too long. So I'm going to end here. So this is just the rest of the chapters of the book, so you can see where the book is headed, and I can say more about that if y'all are interested. But for now, I will stop there, and thank you very much.
What were they protesting at the textile books?
So, low wages, poor conditions. So women were surveilled in the factories. They could only go to the bathroom, 2 times a shift. So that was a big point of contention. Some of the supervisors were just really cruel to them. There's stuff about sexual favors by some of the men supervisors, right? So early, like what we would call sexual harassment now, they were identifying as an issue. And they wanted a union. And so the owner, the mill, did not want to recognize their union. And so one of the most basic things is they wanted the company to recognize that a majority of workers wanted to organize the United Textile Workers Bubble. Any questions? I have a comment about that. Textiles unions, which I'm not familiar with any right now around our area. I know that Gastonia is still, unless it's changed, is still a textile city. But I don't remember, and even remember, any kind of unions in the textiles around East Tennessee, and it was in Toronto.
Well, my grandfather,
Tell me wrong.
yeah, so in Knoxville, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, so they started in La Follette, Tennessee. They started one of the first locals of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, so these are garment workers. They started a union. The women, it's another great story. This is in the 1930s. They took all the shirts that they were making and threw them in the dirt road to protest because the company would recognize them. But they end up organizing. And then in downtown Knoxville, so like the Cherokee Mills, if you know of Cherokee Mills around there, Standard Knitting Mill. So Knoxville is actually a union city. If you look at old photos of Gay Street, a bunch of the union locals had offices on Gay Street. And so you can see the signage from those.
It's probably just not just soft meats.
Yeah, your fan, you would know. Yeah.
Okay, true. Yes.
I think I read a biography about Ella Mae Wiggins. Was part of her assassination and that whole issue also racial tension because she was white and she was fraternizing and helping all the African American families. So it wasn't just about her organizing; it was also about her crossing the line.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, I thought she was the one. That's a really, really great story. I wish I could have the end of vote, but
Yeah, there's a few where she appears, where her story appears. But Like the Family is one of the classic books that tells her story. It's about the textile industry in the South. And yeah, you're exactly right. She was organizing with Black workers in Gastonia, and that was a big no-no, right? I mean, like there
were two totally segregated camps.
right. But her union was interested in organizing across racial lines. And so some of the organizers who had come down from the Northeast, they later wrote, like, we believe that's why she was killed, is because she dared, as a white woman, cross the picket lines. And I've looked at the commentary by the elites in town, and they call her a hard-boiled woman. They talk about her as a sexually promiscuous woman. Almost that she deserved to die. I mean, that's kind of how they paint her. She was a troublemaker. But I mean, it was a truckload of people who went after her and group of workers and shot her.
Right.
What's also striking to me, Sarah, and all of those women were not educated. And the textile workers weren't educated. But Memphis, Tennessee was a Black woman, which is really surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we forget that in the South, after the Civil War, so as Reconstruction happens, and there's there's an infusion of resources to start schools for Black children, white children are also getting schools for the first time. So working class and poor white kids also did not go to school, and they didn't have schools. And so there's a transformation happening, across the South. Only like middle class and elite white children had access to education.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. I, as a former sixth grade educator, I just want to say thank you for including Memphis, Tennessee to begin with, but also for including that she paid out of her pocket to get children fed, because hungry students don't learn, right? I'm sure a lot of people are still doing that. I have to about, yeah, absolutely. So thanks for sharing that. So, yeah.
just, you intrigued me with your number 5 up there that says Lake Bard. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just gave a presentation on this in Knoxville. So Hazel Dickens, does anybody know? Again, welcome to West Virginia. West Virginia is so strong in this book. Hazel Dickens is considered the grandmother of bluegrass music. She moved from West Virginia to Baltimore. So I wanted to tell the story of the Appalachian migration, or what we call the Hillbilly Highway. And so Hazel and her family moved to Baltimore for opportunities, but they were all singers. And in Baltimore, Hazel got involved in the folk scene. So this is the 1950s and 60s. And she becomes a folk singer, pretty widely known folk singer. Her duo, she has a duo later called Hazel and Alice. Alice Gerard is her partner. And I encourage you to look up their records. They're really amazing. They started by singing traditional music, but then Hazel was really moved by watching her brother die from black lung disease. And she wrote an amazing song called Black Lung about his life. And that really politicized her. And then she watched the Mannington mine disaster happen in 1968, where 78 miners, as her lyrics go, 78 miners were burned alive in 1968 because of neglect from the company. And she wrote a song about the mine disaster. And so she kind of became like Ella Mae Wiggins, a troubadour for the labor movement and also for the women's movement. So she and Hazel were really adopted by the 1970s, the burgeoning women's movement. Women were told they couldn't play bluegrass. They said it's too fast and you're not strong enough. And that these two women are playing it better than anybody and writing the best songs. And so when women are organizing, the women's liberation movement, they're turning to the music of Hazel and Alice because Hazel often sang about what it meant to be a working woman. She has a great song called Working Women Blues. So yeah, I can go on and on about Hazel. She's really amazing.
And you're writing a second book, Feminism of the South.
Yes.
Which is not the Betty Friedan kind.
Right. Yeah, the book is called In Sisterhood and Struggle. And again, I like to take on kind of big dominant narratives and be like, what would it be like to tell the story from a different perspective? And so it starts in the South. So kind of all over the South, Georgia. I have a chapter about coal mining women who broke down barriers in the 1970s to work in the mines. Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, and how they made how they made feminism for themselves. They often didn't use that word for various reasons. Some of them did. But I think of feminism as something that you do, not something that you are. Mm-hmm. And so these are women who were fighting for equality in all kinds of ways. And so that book is about them.
When you ask for help, is there a moral kind of conclusion there for everyone?
No, so Ask for Help is about the harm reduction movement in Appalachia. So my family has been touched by the opioid epidemic. And so this last chapter brings me into the story because one thing I want to make clear is that it's social movements are, like as an historian, they're fun to write about. We talk about these amazing organizers and activists. But the reason they're important is because when you are struggling, or your family or community is struggling, you need help. And your life is much easier if you have somebody to turn to help you figure out how to get what you need. How to get medical care, for support, or just, moral support, or whatever it is. Because our region was hit really hard by the opioid epidemic. And so there's all of these, like people of my generation, there's all these organizers and activists who have dedicated their lives to supporting people who have been impacted by that epidemic. And so that is where that comes from.
Yeah, I teach environmental science classes here, and as you were speaking of Sarah Blizzard and telling the story, I just think of the transition from interactions with nature on a family farm to this mining town, and the impact that particularly how women and children food. And just for my personal background, my maternal grandfather worked in the Barabara mines in Copper Basin. And so my father grew up in this very devastated environment, at the Copper Basin. And for me, it's just so important to be close to nature, to have that interaction with the natural environment. So I can't even imagine growing up in that devastation. And to see as I think of the children growing up.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, of course, people didn't just leave that all behind. And so one thing, I don't get into it too much in this book, but one thing I've noticed going through the records is, first of all, these massive, gorgeous bundles that people were growing. And there's a lot of photographs of them, like early photographs. And sometimes, and there would be these gardening contests as well. So people were still trying to do what they could. And then there was, but to your point, you're saying that reminds me of a report I read from the U.S. Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. They sent some women in maybe the 1920s to southern West Virginia to try to figure out what women were doing there, if they were working, what their experience was. And so they have basically all these surveys they did with these women, and a lot of them complain about the environmental issues, right? That it's so dirty, that it's so hard to do laundry, outside it, we can zero out there. Hold on. And then they miss the farm. There is this kind of longing for the kind of work they used to do, which of course was not easy. It's very hard work to have a farm, but they had a different kind of control over that, and it was the family unit working together. Whereas in the coal towns, men's and women's labor gets divided. It's what we call the gendered division of labor, of course, which has a history. And so, there are ways that they're maintaining and holding on, but then also mourning what they lost.
Going back to Sarah Blizzard, you were talking about that they set up the tents for people who were thrown out of the housing there onto the property. So when they came, she and Tim, is that right?
Yeah.
Came into town, did they buy property or how was that?
Yeah, I sort of glided over. I didn't tell you all that part. So they got kicked out of several houses that they rented from the coal companies. Every time they got caught organizing, and Sarah was often involved in organizing. And so I think it's the third time they get evicted. She says, according to family lore, she says, we're never renting a house from another coal company. We're going to own our own home. And she had been working as a domestic worker in a boarding house. And so it's her wages that they're able to pool to then buy this plot of land, along with Timothy's family. He had some brothers who had become lawyers. So I think they probably had family help as well. But they buy, I think it's maybe 15 acres. It's not much land. So they buy 15 acres, and it's in Eskdale, which is in southern West Virginia, a little town that was not owned by the company. So it was called a free town.
And how far from where he was?
It was along Cabin Creek, so not far from the mines at all. But by that point, Timothy had been blacklisted. So her sons were working in the mines. He was working as a peddler, but he was also union organizing. That's really what he was doing all the time. And he had other little jobs that he would do. And so he is, working with the United Mine Workers, Mother Jones. They're getting arms, munitions sent I think that Timothy is involved in collecting some of those R's and distributing them. So both of them are very involved in making this strike happen.
Hunt. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else?
This just makes me feel like a total wimp. Things they're doing, you know.
But no, it's supposed to inspire you. It's supposed to be a lesson to like help inspire you to
I
do
mean, the biggest thing I've done is fight for 4 years to build a dog park, you know.
That's a quality of life issue.
Yeah.
Now, to me, tells a story of the young people today versus then, because you were saying they got married at 13, 15, whatever, and they really had a purpose in life to be successful. And me, as a owner of a company, have so much trouble now getting somebody to come in the door to work. You know, it's so, and it's just a difference in, I don't know, mentality, drive, but women in this day, they were tough. And some of us today do it. That's true. Anybody else?
Oh, I don't really have a question, but maybe you can talk just this week. I think we've talked about like secret gardens and the kind of ethnic diversity of these communities in the mine wars that might, like, that's kind of an interesting issue up against.
Yeah. So just as an important point, that during these labor struggles of the mine wars, these communities were about a third white mountaineers. People were coming from the far to the coal towns. About a third were immigrants. I mean, in some of these places, there were like 20-something languages spoken. So immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and then a third African American. And that was by design. So the coal operators talked about what they called judicious mixture, which was what they believed is that you had a labor force that was segregated by race and by ethnicity, they will never join forces. They will never build solidarity with one another, and they won't, they're not going to join unions together and fight for anything. And so, again, that's what the operators believed, but that's not ultimately what happened. So the mine wars are also really interesting because it's a moment of cross-race, cross-ethnic, and cross-gender. And that one's usually left out, but there's so many women involved. Solidarity in these communities, fighting for workplace rights, but also what I would argue is they were fighting for the right to live, really. I mean, this was about sustaining their lives. And so these were really diverse places. We think of West Virginia today as it doesn't seem diverse. It's, I think, the whitest state in the Union. But in early 20th century West Virginia, it was one of the most diverse places. Your family history kind of gets into this as well. So a lot of immigrants, like people moving from all over the place to work and live there.
Another thing that she's written, and I think you do teach it in class, Living with Dolly Parton.
Every freshman reads it.
Everybody should read it. It is really enlightening.
Don't be mad at me.
Yeah, I know.
It's like just trying to get us, again, to think historically about things that we just maybe never ask questions about. Yeah, so that's kind of my goal with it.
Yeah. And she's still loved, for sure.
Totally.
Yeah, but look it up. It's very interesting. Where was it published?
It was published for a creative nonfiction publication called Long Reads. But if you just Google it, Living with Dolly Parton, I get it'll come up.
All right. Oh, this has been going,